Welcome to Legal Innovation Spotlight, the podcast that brings you the latest advancements in legal tech and knowledge management. I'm Ted Theodoropoulos, and I connect with the industry's brightest minds to provide you with valuable insights and actionable takeaways. So sit back, relax, and let's dive in. Mr. Joe Davis, how are you, sir?
Doing well, thank you.
Awesome. I really appreciate you joining us today. And we're going to talk about your article. So you had a recent ILTA white paper and discussed the future of Microsoft Teams in legal, which is of interest to us being a SharePoint/Teams integrator. Infodash runs on SharePoint, but we integrate very closely with Teams. But before we get into the article, why don't you just take a minute or two and introduce yourself and what your background is?
Sure. So I am currently the manager of knowledge management solutions at Davis Wright Tremaine. Been here for about 2.5 years, but I've spent over 20 years in legal. Started out at a little intellectual property firm, went over, did some big law firms, Debevoise and Plimpton, Paul Weiss, McCarter and English. I spent some time in-house on the in-house legal tech team with Prudential. I've worked on a little bit on the vendor side as well. So I've been doing this a while.
You have, and you and I've known each other for a while. I think we met. You were the ILTA rep for New York City, right? We were doing road shows, and
Yep. That's
how we got connected. And then, just to give a little background, you and I co-wrote an article for ILTA. This is probably close to 10 years ago, at least 7 or 8, about Matter Center and Microsoft's Matter Center. And the name of the article was, oh, you still have it. Look at that.
I just happen to have it here on my desk.
Amazing.
You still look pretty much the same. You're very small over here. You're bigger in real life. I
have less hair, I'm sure. That's a steady progression, unfortunately.
But this was winter of 2014, so it is almost 10 years.
Wow. So just a little bit of background on me. So I used to work for Microsoft. I've been a developer in the Microsoft space for a long, long time, since the probably Visual Basic 4 days. And so I've been around the Microsoft ecosystem for a long time, and I had some opinions on Matter Center. You had some opinions. We agreed on some things, not on others. I struggled to really see a future for Matter Center just because Microsoft really, industry-specific solutions is not really what they do. With the exception of they have a few Microsoft Dynamics solutions that they acquired through when they did the Great Plains acquisition. But in general, Microsoft. So I struggled to see where it was going. You had some different opinions. We wrote the article, and I think we were both wrong. I mean, it didn't do what I thought it would do. I don't think it did what you thought it would do. But c'est la vie. Here we are today.
I think, to be fair, you ended up more right than I did. I think I was a little more optimistic. And you were a little more correct, I think. History would show. I still hold to the sort of optimism, and some of that, I think, to this day, even in that Teams article, as we talk about document management. But in terms of, did Matter Center, make the splash that I had hoped it would? Short answer is no.
Yeah, it did not. Now, I think just so people kind of note, to tie a bow on that, where it landed was there's a vendor out there who essentially Microsoft kind of gave up on it, open sourced it. We tried to implement it internally at AcroWire. So AcroWire is the parent company to Infodash, and we were a SharePoint integrator. We couldn't get it to run, even with Microsoft's help. And they had vendors working on the product, and those vendors kind of went away. The people who were sponsoring, it's now called Legal and Corporate Affairs. No, it's now called, it's a different acronym. So they kind of reorged, and the sponsors on the Microsoft side went away. I feel very differently about Microsoft Teams, and I feel like its place in legal has a bright future. And your article is titled, and I think this is a white paper, correct? Not a peer-to-peer?
Right, yeah.
Okay. And the title is The Future of Microsoft Teams. And you basically, correct me if I'm wrong here, but you make 5 predictions about where Microsoft Teams will be in legal by the year 2025.
Yeah.
So in just a couple of years. And I read the article, and as usual, I agree with some things. I see other things differently. And then, there's one of your predictions I really honestly am not informed enough to have a real strong opinion on. But let's go through these kind of one by one and kick them around a little bit.
Yeah.
So your first prediction is that external collaboration with clients via Teams will be common in 2025. This one we are completely aligned on. It's, since COVID and the remote and hybrid work that has taken place since then, Teams has exploded everywhere, especially in the enterprise. But, things that happen in the enterprise eventually make their way into legal because those are the clients of law firms. Right. So I am aligned with this, but kind of give me your thinking as to how you came to that conclusion.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it seems kind of like the Holy Grail. Clients want to be able to communicate with their law firms. Law firms, at least say they want to be able to communicate with their clients. And technology-wise, law firm technology has been kind of easy to keep within the walls of the law firm, whether that's your drafting tools that are in Word or your e-discovery or even your document management system. It's been easy to say, well, that's law firm technology, and that's what we use kind of behind the scenes. Mr. and Ms. Client, you don't get that. That's how we make the sausage at the law firm. And law firms have been able to kind of continue with that as their, kind of continue to lead with that, from the beginning of the technology era. It's been easy to just kind of keep that stuff in-house. Here's the catch. With Teams, our clients have it too. Our clients, our law firms' clients, not only have it, they're arguably doing a better job in deploying it and configuring it and using it than the law firms are. Law firms like to think that they are, at the bleeding edge of everything, but sometimes that's not the case. And I think it's going to be table stakes. Where clients say, well, what do you mean we can't communicate with you on Teams? I mean, it would be like 20, 25 years ago saying, well, email is only an internal tool. We only email within the firm. We don't communicate with clients via email. And honestly, 20 years ago, I heard lawyers say that. It didn't take too long for them to realize, oh, okay, this is actually a business tool that we can use to communicate with our clients. Did the lawyers drive that? Probably not. I think the clients did. And clients that are using Teams and using Teams to communicate internally are going to say, well, what do you mean we can't communicate with our law firm that way? And I think if law firms sort of continue to take the attitude where they say, well, I don't want to do that. I can't share with the client. Clients are going to say, well, okay, if you can't share, fine. We'll share it out of our Teams tenant. And we can put the documents and the posts and all the stuff. We can host that in our tenant. And if that doesn't scare law firms, it absolutely should, because that blows up the whole paradigm of now the client. I mean, of course, we always say, oh, it's all the client's work anyway. But law firms, I think, have a legitimate stake in saying, well, no, but we have policies that govern that, and the retention and the disposition and all that stuff. And I think largely that's true, or at least that's the claim. But also it blows up the paradigm of, kind of who is the custodian of that, of the stuff.
The work product.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And as soon as the lawyers start doing work in the tenant of the client, that really flips a paradigm. And I don't think that they're prepared for that. So I think there's still some things to be worked out. But I think if law firms don't get on the ball and say, here's how we're going to do this, they're going to lose control. It's not that it's not going to happen. It's just going to happen in the client's tenant rather than the law firms. And I think that is far worse. But either way you slice it, the communication is going to be happening. And law firms, much like it did with email, and law firms just kind of need to get on the ball, accept it, understand it, and be ready.
Yeah. So agreed. There's a concept called shared channels, so shared channels are a mechanism for two collaborating organizations to essentially federate their domains in some capacity. I don't think they use the term federation, but something along those lines. And once, that happens by the admins deep in IT. But once that happens, organizations can then share channels. So the hierarchy in teams is fairly flat, but you have teams, multiple teams, and then you have multiple channels within those teams. You can share channels with that external organization. And the benefit there is it's frictionless. So there's no, let's say I work for Coca-Cola and you're at DWT. I have a matter with DWT and I want to collaborate. Well, we're Teams users at Coca-Cola and I don't have to log out of my Teams tenant. I don't have to go to a new URL. I don't have a new user interface. I'm where I work every day. I see notifications. It's the most frictionless way. We actually at Infodash are betting on that Teams will be a mechanism for the new extranet paradigm, right?
Yeah.
Just because of that. Shared channels just make it so frictionless that it feels inevitable that it's going to go that way because it just makes sense.
Yeah, it actually kind of blows up the idea of an extranet, being a separate thing, and we have to set that up, and it's a separate entity, and I take my work and I put it in the extranet, and then if I'm the client, I go to the that is not frictionless.
Right.
But doing it in Teams in the same interface that I communicate internally, that I can communicate externally and share documents and co-author documents and ask questions and get answers. I mean, I agree. I think it's inevitable because of that frictionless environment. What I think isn't frictionless, at least right now, is setting up that environment.
Right.
That is right now. I think that is actually pretty complicated. And let's face it, there's a lot at stake. We're if law firms are letting clients into a piece of their environment, and that is concerning. That is absolutely important to get that right. And right now, frankly, I think it's too difficult to do that. You need that is not for the faint of heart. You need some engineering skill to be able to understand which buttons to push and which options to select. More on that later, but that part right now is too hard, but it'll get easier.
Yeah. I mean, it was just released. It's not even been out a year. Shared channels specifically. Right. I think a huge risk for the shared channels paradigm in law firms is inadvertently communicating where somebody on the law firm side thought it was a private conversation. So the amount of training that's going to be required, and somehow Microsoft is going to have to make it super explicit, that, and there's going to it's going to be incumbent upon the law firms to train their partners, especially older partners that maybe aren't as tech savvy.
Sure.
they're going to have to understand that what they type is going to be visible by the client, because that could be disastrous.
Sure.
Yeah. So I think I think they'll get that right. So for prediction 1, external collaboration with clients via Teams will be common by 2025. We're on board. We're aligned. Your next prediction, provisioning Teams via Power Automate will be a core IT skill by 2025. Tell me how you came to that conclusion.
Yeah. So speaking of things that are a little bit too difficult right now in the Teams environment, figuring out exactly what the paradigm is for creating a team within Teams, that's lowercase t within, uppercase T teams. I've seen lots of demos where vendors say, oh, well, so that anybody can create a team. And if you don't lock things down, that's the way it is by default within Microsoft Teams. And, anybody who's been in IT for more than 5 minutes knows, oh, that's going to be a disaster. And some firms have found that out the hard way. And so it becomes a question of, okay, so if I'm an attorney and I need a team for my client, how does that happen? Whether I'm sharing with them or not, so this could be today as opposed to, when we start sharing tomorrow. How does that get created? And, what are the contents of that team? Like, are we using things like Planner or Whiteboard? Like, are they in the team to begin with? Or are those things that get added by request later? Does every matter that my firm works on need a team? Probably not. But I think we'll see the number grow, but there are things that probably don't need a team. Ultimately, creating teams is another thing that is probably still a little bit too difficult right now. And so there have been vendors who are trying to answer that, like to meet that need. How do we create these things? Is it automated? It's sort of analogous to in the document management world. If I open a new client or a new matter, how does that folder get created in my DMS, and what folders does that have in it? A transactional matter is different than a litigation matter. And so ultimately, my prediction here is that right now this is still too hard. There are vendors that have tried to step in and fill that gap. I think some more successfully than others, but with a variety of different paradigms. Ultimately, I'm thinking Microsoft really needs to make this much easier. I think the logical way that will happen is with Power Automate, which is, available now. Yeah. I think they can still make it a little bit easier within Power Automate, but here's the twist. I think that creating those teams using Power Automate or whatever tool, I think that's going to be a common core IT skill, like creating a file share or creating an Exchange mailbox. Just stuff that you expect even your entry level sysadmins to be able to do. It's just going to find its way into that short list of things that are table stakes. Because I think it's going to be that important. I think it, just as important as creating an Exchange mailbox or a shared folder, and being able to manage those as well. I think it just has to happen. I don't think we're quite there yet, but I think in order for teams to really be a part of what we do and the way we do it all day, every day, that the provisioning part has got to become a core skill.
Yeah. And I think you provided some statistics here that you pulled from the last year's tech survey, or maybe I pulled them. And one of them was that 75% of respondents create teams manually today, right. Which, there's really not that many ways to do it, right? You can do it PowerShell, you can do it in the UI.
Right, exactly.
You can use a third-party tool. In legal, there's a few legal specific ones. Cloud Access Manager, otherwise known as CAM, used to be Prosperware, now Latera.
Yep.
IntApp has a product that does it.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are non-legal specific solutions like Orchestry that do a phenomenal job.
Yep.
So yeah, is it going to be Power Automate or one of those third-party tools, or is Microsoft going to come to the table? I think, maybe I would phrase it, I agree with you, because if number one is right, number two kind of has to be right. It doesn't have to be Power Automate, but it needs to be some sort of workflow automation,
Yeah. Like I think, for example, you can't have, let's pick on Exchange for a minute. You can't say, as Microsoft, we've got the best email server out there, or at least the most ubiquitous one. But you need a third party tool to be able to create email boxes. That just doesn't fly. Like there's got to be a better way to do it, without using an external tool. And I figure Power Automate probably is the best, like that is the most logical way to do it. Could be wrong. They could come out with some new tool that's designed just for that. Okay.
Yeah. I think it depends. So, I was on the SQL team at Microsoft, and there's a platform out there called SQL Sentry that provides some very advanced management around SQL clusters and SQL farms. And you know what, Microsoft, it's been a little while. I still write SQL. That's my one skill that I keep somewhat honed. The rest are very rusty. If I had to go build a web app now, I'd be using a lot of Chat GPT to help me out. But I'm still very savvy on the SQL side. I have not really kept up on the tooling around it, but for years, there was an ecosystem of utilities that people used. Another one, SQL Compare. When you deploy from dev to test to production.
Yep.
Microsoft's out of the box tools, they do have a few things, but they're not great. And so, it's hard to see, but I think we're aligned on number two, that some sort of automation around provisioning will happen, and that's probably a reasonable time frame, 2025, 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's doable now, as you said, sort of manually, but that's not scalable. I mean, for as many matters as get opened in an average law firm in a day, it's just not scalable to try to do that stuff manually. No. So there's got to be a better way.
Yeah, and you need workflow, right? There has to be an approval process.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It cannot be the Wild West.
Yeah. All right. So number three, Teams engineers will overtake DMS engineers in legal by 2025.
Yeah.
Okay. This one I'm not aligned on. So as usual, we agree on a couple of things, disagree on others. So before I plead my case, why don't you tell me kind of where your thinking originated from on this?
Yeah, I mean, it sort of flows logically from what we were just saying, in that it can't be the Wild West. I think there are some firms, mine included, that rolled out Teams quickly. Pandemic happened, and aligned with the sunsetting of the Skype platform, and so I think there were a lot of firms who rolled out Teams because it was the replacement for Skype, and then seemed like geniuses because the pandemic happened and they had this new tool. But we didn't have the full controls in place. So there were people creating Teams before we had sort of turned that feature off for people. Ultimately, what made me kind of think along these lines is that there needs to be engineering around the Teams platform. It is not a set it and forget it kind of thing. We talked about the provisioning, but I think that there's the provisioning of Teams, but there's also we also talked about the granting of external access. There's the whole idea of bringing in non-Teams apps within the Teams environment. I'm talking like Planner, I guess Microsoft would call them, apps. Of course, they call everything apps. But the things that aren't standard within teams but work really well within a team, planner, whiteboard, and those are the
OneNote.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Those are the ones that are Microsoft based. But what about the ones that aren't Microsoft based? Who gets to vet those? Who gets to do those integrations? How do we make sure that that Teams is running well, that it's configured well? Even from a network point of view, are things tuned so that calls, video or audio are optimized? Right. Things like that. I think especially in law firms, we've seen that there's usually even in a call it a mid-sized firm, there's probably somebody whose job it is to look after the DMS.
Right.
And I think what we're going to see is that, DMS technology, let's call that a mature technology at this point. We've been doing it for a while. It's not really bleeding edge anymore.
Right.
It's pretty well known and understood. Teams is really, it's still new. And so there's still a lot of engineering to be done around it. And they're always introducing new stuff. They're always Microsoft is tweaking and changing. I mean, we've just heard within the past week or two that they have rewritten Teams from the ground up.
Yes.
I'm not sure, I don't have enough information on that yet. But I don't remember that ever happening with a Microsoft product before. That it's out there and then they say, oh, it's only been out there for a couple of years, but now we've rewritten it from the ground up. I mean, they've certainly done that after, with different iterations like Internet Explorer and things like that.
But, even, yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, the old Windows 3X, 95, 97,
sure.
Millennium Edition, that essentially ended and they rewrote it, which based on the old Windows NT, right? That Windows 2000 was based on Windows NT, that became XP, that became Windows 7.
Right.
So yeah, it has happened, but it's not the commonplace model.
Right. Exactly. And I think that that is an indication of how important Microsoft thinks that Teams is.
For sure.
If they didn't think this was all that important, they probably wouldn't have bothered.
Right.
Because it works. It's working okay.
Yeah.
But they tore it down and rewrote it. Anyway, the point here is that it's still an evolving field, and we're just going to need some of our, frankly, our best and brightest engineering minds to be working around Teams, because that's where our people are going to be working.
Yeah.
And I think some of those folks, if they're smart, will probably migrate from the DMS world into Teams, because, this is technology, none of these skills sort of last forever. And so it is not a set it and forget it technology. It's constantly evolving. It's constantly changing. The team that you created yesterday will be different from the team that you create tomorrow. And it just needs smart people thinking about this and working on it. So I think that, especially if we agree that it's going to be client facing, we're going to want this to be done. We law firms want this to be done really well. And so I think we're just going to increase the number of engineers who are not only able to work on it, who have the training and the background and the skills, but who are actually working on it. I think we need them less on the DMS side than we do on the Teams side.
So let me tell you why I disagree with this, because I agreed with your first two. Your first prediction is that collaboration via Teams will be common by 2025 with clients. Common. You said provisioning Teams via Power Automate will be a core IT skill by 2025. Here, we've gotten a little more quantitative, right? Which is that Teams engineers will overtake DMS engineers in legal by 2025. We could measure that, right? Common core IT skill. Yeah. Okay. Maybe there's a little bit of subjectivity, but I honestly think I see the horizon a little bit further out than 2025 when inflection points like that become realistic. So while I think teams, I agree with what you're saying around teams requiring some engineering skills to manage. I do believe that it's, the cloud in general requires much less. Right? So think, on-prem iManage versus NetDocs, right? The amount of engineering skills that you have to have in place in those two different paradigms, vastly different, right? You've got servers, you've got storage, you've got colos, you've got infrastructure, you have hardware refreshes. All of those things start to go away as people move into the cloud.
Right.
So you're already there with Teams, right? It's already in the cloud. So you don't have any of that back end infrastructure to manage. So, as DMs move to the cloud, primarily iManage, right? They've made a huge push, and we have clients every day that are making the switch. A lot of that engineering talent will have to be reallocated or eliminated. So I think it will balance out a bit, but I would be really surprised by 2025. And I'm not sure how much your fourth prediction ties into your third, but why don't we jump into that? Because there's a relationship there. If you're right
they
about,
all tie together, of course.
They're very interrelated.
Yeah.
So, so your fourth prediction is that native legal document management will become common in Teams by 2025.
Yeah.
And this one, I'm very much not aligned on. This has been my challenge forever with how just the architecture. Documents get managed in Teams on SharePoint, right? It's SharePoint storage. SharePoint is an amalgamation of, OneDrive is SharePoint. The telephony and video conferencing is Skype for Business that used to be Communicator, right? That just kind of evolved. And then there's some new things that they put on top that you can tell are really new, like Planner. It's very rudimentary and basic, and it does some, it's Fisher Price,
right?
We'll put it that way.
Yeah.
So the way that SharePoint stores documents, and I guess I'm going to plead my case on this one first, and then I'll hand it over to you. So the last SharePoint release that we had on-prem was 2019, and as of 2019, the way that Microsoft stores documents in SharePoint is basically in a relational database, in a blob, a binary long object. That architecture does not scale. Now, what are they doing behind the scenes in SharePoint Online? I have no idea, but we can't say that, well, it's not my problem, because it is your problem. And the reason is, try getting large payloads of documents in and out of SharePoint. It's really, really difficult. It's really slow, even if you use third-party tools. Now, you could say that, well, it's also hard to get big payloads of documents in and out of iManage Cloud or NetDocs, right? We run into limitations all the time. They have to manage capacity there. The difference is that you can call, if you're a big law firm, you've got somebody you can call at NetDocs or iManage and figure out a solution. You're never going to get in touch with anybody who has any control at Microsoft. And I do mean ever. It's just never going to happen.
Right, sure.
So because documents are the lifeblood of a law firm, right? Like doing a DM migration or, switching vendors is like open heart surgery. Everything revolves around documents. Because it's so critical, I can't imagine a scenario where an AM law firm, and I guess I'm disagreeing with DM being common in Teams in the AM law world. In the smaller law firm space, the document payloads aren't nearly as big. I mean, you have sometimes petabytes worth of data in big law firms. I wouldn't be able to sleep at night as the CIO of an AM law firm with my documents sitting there. And if something goes wrong, I can't call somebody who can actually make something happen. So the scalability, the loss of control, the support model that Microsoft employs all seem grossly inadequate to accommodate something that's so important for law firms. That's my position on it.
But it's cheaper.
Mm-hmm.
Firms are already paying for that storage.
Sure.
In SharePoint. And frankly, the moving of, sort of the seeding of that collection, that's an IT problem. That's not a lawyer problem. Lawyers just, want to be able to get to their documents, the onesies and twosies, by and large. I mean, there are certainly some exceptions to that. I heard somebody say that document management in this day and age is more of a process than a product. It used to be when you were talking about managing your documents, you had to have a document management system or else you weren't really managing your documents, certainly at scale anyway. And I think that that's less true. I think people understand a little bit more about how to do this and how to share than they used to. I think SharePoint, and the dirty little secret is that under the hood of Teams is SharePoint, just like it is for OneDrive. Not everybody understands that. But putting documents in SharePoint, I think is going to be more appealing because of all the things that we've already talked about. If I'm a law firm and you're the client and you say, well, we want to collaborate in Teams, where do those documents need to be? They need to be in SharePoint, and we need to be able to manage them and work on them within Teams, because chances are we're going to work on them. We're going to want to work on them together, or maybe you as the client are going to want that. Lawyers, they may not want that yet. Although I've heard co-authoring referred to as the feature that people didn't know that they couldn't live without. Mm-hmm. Traditional document management, even DM in the cloud, has not really still kind of chokes on this idea of co-authoring. But that is part of the deal in SharePoint and Teams, that you can work on a document in the same document at the same time, and that's a big deal, for attorneys working together or attorneys working with their clients. That's a big deal. And I think once people understand that they can do that, like they do in a Google Doc, I've even had attorneys, even as recently as this week, say to me, well, can't we make it like a Google Doc that we can just work on it, in the same, at the same time? Once they realize they can do that and be able to communicate, seamlessly, right beside the posts, and the chat with their clients. And this is the same environment that they're taking the meetings in, and they can share it in a meeting and co-author. I mean, it seems like, why would you ever want to silo away your documents, in some other system where they're not as accessible? Now, I agree that we are not quite there yet, and there are absolutely challenges in doing that. But I think this is one where the business case is absolutely going to drive the technology, and the business side is going to say, "Hey, IT, figure this out, make it work. This is what we need to do." And there's some challenges there from an IT perspective. I totally agree, but I think it has to happen because it's just so logical. To not work on your documents in the same environment that you're doing everything else is just going to make less and less sense.
Yeah, I mean, so how it happens today is, SharePoint is a frequent platform choice for extranet,
mm-hmm.
right? So, take the vendors out of the space for a minute, like HiQ. But when law firms go custom dev, we built at AcroWire a ton of bespoke SharePoint solutions to provide extranet capabilities. How that happens is those documents get temporarily synced into SharePoint for those sorts of activities, and then they make their way back into the DM and stay there, right? Once the matter
mm-hmm.
concludes. So I could see that happening. Now, I guess you could say, well, if it's good enough for temporary storage, why isn't it good for permanent storage? And then I think we have to talk about all the constraints. If you use it in a kind of as a temporary. Think about your desktop, like your actual physical desktop. You pull documents. I mean, we don't do this anymore, but we did out of a file folder. You put them on your desk, you work on them, and then you put them away for long-term storage or even medium-term storage. So I could see SharePoint and Teams, I'm using those terms interchangeably, as being document stores in that capacity. But for the long-term storage and search, yes, SharePoint has search, and yes, it's getting better. And now you have things like Azure Cognitive Search that we use in Infodash to help augment and apply concepts like AI and machine learning, image cracking and reading text on the inside of images, those sorts of things. Yes, that exists, but yeah, I just have a hard time getting to mentally. Definitely not by 2025. And you know what? I think I mentioned this to you before. I'll bet you a steak dinner at ILTA 2025 if there is one AM law firm who uses SharePoint as their primary DM and the CIO doesn't want to jump out of a window.
That assumes that there will ever be firms where the CIO isn't like near the window anyway, for any number of different reasons.
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned some of the newer Microsoft technology. I mean, like we haven't mentioned ChatGPT, which is just the the whole advent of this new AI, which has just really taken over the headlines in the last really just the last 2 months, let's say, that it's really become top of mind. And you take a service like that, like Azure AI, for example, which in full disclosure, I know just enough about to be dangerous. But all the stuff that Microsoft is going to come out with, if we're going to continue to lock our documents away in a silo, all of that stuff is, all of whatever AI is hot today, tomorrow, and the next day, we're still going to have trouble running that against our documents because the documents are siloed off. And I think that there's another reason that's just going to continue. That made sense at one point, but I think it makes less and less sense every day for the collaboration reasons, for the AI reasons, and who knows what's coming out tomorrow. So that's kind of where this, where the native legal document management idea comes from. And I'll say that the big DMS vendors, iManage and NetDocs, have plugins, within Teams where you can get to the documents. And I think it's kind of a horse race as to which one is better, right now. I mean, I guess the best one, is the one from whichever DMS you're using. Mm-hmm. And they're good. I mean, they're better than nothing. I don't think they're native document management. So it's certainly better than nothing, but it certainly doesn't give you the full functionality of having documents right there in the same space that you're collaborating in.
Yeah.
That's, I mean, by 2025, I don't know, we'll see. But I do think it just makes too much sense for it to not happen.
Yeah. So, you know what? I just thought of something. We ought to have a full episode just on this topic because there's so many things, there's so many tentacles here to explore, like governance, security. I mean, ChatGPT was just thrown out of Italy for GDPR.
Yes.
I actually made a joke on LinkedIn recently that if you go to ChatGPT and ask, can I put pineapple on pizza? ChatGPT says yes. I think that's the real reason that it was kicked out of Italy. But I think we need to do another episode and talk about this and maybe bring some other people into the conversation because it is a interesting topic and it's something that this topic doesn't go away. I've been hearing about this since 2008 about how law firms are going to go to SharePoint as a DM, and we keep talking about it. So yeah, let's definitely explore that further in another episode. All right, so I'm not with you on that one, Mr. Joe. I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to disagree with you. Well, if I'm wrong, you get a steak dinner at ILTA 2025, right? So
I accept.
There you go. All right. So the last prediction was that Teams will be a common choice for telephony by 2025. And, this is an area that is really outside of the purview of Infodash, and even back when we used to be AcroWire.
Mm-hmm.
It's really kind of the managed service providers play in that telephony space. It makes sense. I mean, if they continue to improve. I know there's a lot of obstacles still today that they're figuring out, but I know that there's an appetite to go, full VoIP soft phone. So I'm kind of neutral on this one. I don't have an opinion, but what was your logic behind it?
Yeah, I mean, it's outside of my comfort zone too. But as I put together this presentation for ILTACon, I started hearing from people, where it is in their wheelhouse. One vendor in particular was a reseller of Zoom phones, and Zoom phones, like, to their credit, Zoom kind of came out with this phone thing, and lots of people liked it, and it seemed like they did it reasonably well.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were a reseller until they tried the telephony within Teams and went, oh, actually, this is better. Like, from a technological perspective, they liked it better. The quality, the sound quality was better, and so they switched over to doing telephony in Teams, and the savings, the cost savings, was really impressive. They went from spending, and they're a consulting company of, I don't know, maybe somewhere between 50 and 100 people, from spending $3,000 a month on phones to spending $300 a month.
Wow.
Now, and the folks at law firms, I think, still use, telephony more than a small consulting company, so,
Mm-hmm.
I think there are a couple of factors. I mean, the fact that Teams is becoming more ubiquitous, it's on so many desktops, and the user numbers continue to grow. I think that there's a great mobile client for Teams, so you can do calls literally through the Teams mobile client. I also think that coming out of the pandemic, there's never been a time where folks have been more used to wearing a headset at home, as opposed to actually having to pick up the handset. That's always been the problem. Well, I still need my handset. I still need to hold that to my head. Okay. And Teams can still do that if that's the way you choose to roll. But, people wearing these headsets, that happened, during the pandemic, and people are used to it. So I think that combined with the cost savings is really going to, we're going to see Teams adoption in phones soon. Especially, I don't think anybody's in a hurry to do it, but I think as those contracts expire or up for renewal, with your Cisco or your Avaya or whoever those phone providers are who are providing voice over IP, handsets. I think those, when they're up for renewal, people are going to say, wait, we're spending how much on this? And we could do it in technology we already have. I think we're switching, and I haven't used it personally within Teams, but people, reliable sources tell me it's really quite good. Yeah. So I think as those contracts come up for renewal, we're going to see firms just making that move and trying to make it as seamless as possible.
That makes sense. Yeah, I mean, that's hard to argue with. If it's there and it works, you don't have kind of all the challenges that we talked about with the document management side on the telephony side. So I do think that that's much more viable.
Right, and we'll see those engineers who used to be Cisco phone engineers, now they're Teams phone engineers, and that kind of feeds into the idea. That's my way of helping to convince you on which was it? Number 3.
Number 3. Yeah. Okay. We'll and that's a fair point. If you're right about number 5, then yeah. And especially with telephony, that it's synchronous. It's not an asynchronous process, right? Which means that if there's any latency, you can get away with that in a chat.
Sure.
Right? But not with a voice call or a video call.
Definitely.
So, okay. That's fair. Well, this has been an awesome conversation. One thing I do appreciate is that, you put yourself out there. I mean, you're making some predictions. It's not just, fluff, and you put dates, and some of these can be measured. So I appreciate that. I think it's real easy to stay safe, and you put yourself out there, man. So good for you. We will put a link to your article in the comments here, and we look forward to seeing who's right in 2025. But before then, we're going to have another conversation around native legal document management in Teams/SharePoint. That's just too good of a topic to not explore further.
And the only one that it seems like that we have the remaining, like that remains the one that we're not altogether on. I think I may have moved the needle for you a little bit on the engineering. We'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Yeah, that's fair. Yep. It's going to be a lot of work. It's going to be an uphill battle to get me on board with number 4. But anyway, this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate you coming on, and your article's great. We'll share that widely with this conversation, and we look forward to the next chat.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thanks, Joe. Thanks for listening to Legal Innovation Spotlight. If you found value in this chat, hit the subscribe button to be notified when we release new episodes. We'd also really appreciate it if you could take a moment to rate us and leave us a review wherever you're listening right now. Your feedback helps us provide you with top-notch content. Want to dive deeper into the world of legal innovation? Connect with us online at getinfodash.com, where you'll find additional resources and articles. You can also follow us on social media at getinfodash to stay updated on the latest news and insights in the field of legal tech and knowledge management. Once again, thank you for joining us today on Legal Innovation Spotlight, a fireside chat series hosted by Infodash.